So you've probably been taking those photos with those beautiful background blur or adjusting your aperture to its maximum number in hoping to get that sharp image. However, do you know that there are actually potential dangers that camera aperture can bring to every photo taking, which could potentially destroy your photos? Are you surprised? Are you worried? In this video, we'll go even deeper into camera aperture, where I'll talk about the side effects that camera aperture can bring to your photos and how you can prevent them in your photo takings. Meanwhile, in case you miss it, be sure to check out my previous video on camera aperture, links in the description down below and up at the corner of the screen. With that said, let's dive right in. Hey, what's up everyone? Maximilian here from MW Photography. In this channel, I hope that you can join me as we embark this journey to explore the wonders of photography, to capturing life's precious moments, and to creating art. So if you're new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell icon to be notified on future videos. Now, a recap on aperture in general. In my previous video, I mentioned the 4 terminologies used for aperture: the f-number or f-stop, increasing or decreasing stops, the depth of field, and wide open versus closing down lenses, and also the effect of changing of the f-numbers could bring to our photos. Briefly speaking, the smaller the f-number, the larger the aperture opening, the larger the foreground and background blur, giving a shallow depth of field, and this is usually seen in fast or wide open lenses. While the larger the f-number, the smaller the aperture opening, the smaller the foreground and background blur, giving a wide depth of field, and this is seen in slow or closed down lenses. So what are the real dangers that aperture could potentially bring? The first danger is lens aberration. Aside from aperture, please note that lens aberration is also dependent on the quality of lenses. Now, all lenses are manufactured in different ways. Therefore, lenses can produce images which are blurry in certain apertures and cause some degradation in the size of the images. This, in general, are considered as lens aberration. Now, as light passes through the lens, the light passes through the center and edges of the lens. As the center of the lens are usually designed and manufactured more easily as compared to its edges, the wider the aperture opening, light passes through the edge of the lens even more, which in turn may cause some quality degradation in the image. While when the aperture is closed down, more light passes through the center of the lens, while lesser light passes through the edges, making the image seem to be sharper, when in fact it is actually a reduce in aberrations. In general, apertures ranging from f4, f5.6 and f8 are good enough to get a sharp image, to block those unwanted lights from the edges of the lenses. It must be noted that this is by no means absolute, as the images may still be affected by other forms of aberrations. Aberrations can come in a variety of terms. To name a few, there are the diffraction, chromatic aberration, vignetting, and ghosting lens flares. First, we talk about diffraction. As mentioned before, larger the f-number, the smaller the aperture opening and the smaller the foreground and background blur, hence bringing in the foreground and background objects into focus. So does that mean that we can increase the aperture number as high as possible to get the image in focus, or in trying to getting the sharpest image? Absolutely not. Just as we learn in physics, there's a principle called diffraction, which can pose a great danger to the finalized image. When you use, say, an aperture of f22, you are actually squeezing all the light rays that are passing through the lens opening. The light rays will then bend, scatter, and clash with each other, causing a blurry and less sharp image. This usually starts at around f16. The sharpness of aperture is dependent on the types of lenses out there. Sharpest point means the degree where all the lines and parts with contrast are the sharpest and not the focus plane of the photo. In general, an aperture of f8 are acceptable in lenses. However, if you're using a micro four thirds camera or APS-C camera, you can try multiplying the aperture numbers by 2 and 1.5 respectively to get a clearer picture on how high the aperture you're actually shooting in. For example, if you're shooting at f8 in your micro four thirds camera, you can multiply it by 2 and it'll be equivalent to f16 in a full frame camera. So now you can estimate if you're too high in the f number, which could actually produce a blurry photo. Despite all this, please don't be afraid to try out the different apertures to capture the images. The effects of diffraction should be minimal unless you make huge prints where it might be visible. Otherwise, if you're just planning to post it on the internet, please don't be afraid to increase the aperture number if you need to. Next, let's talk about chromatic aberration. Chromatic aberration is also known as color fringing or purple fringing. It happens when wavelengths of colors entering the lenses are not focused on the same focal plane, and when these wavelengths of colors are focused at different positions on the focal plane. And as a result, you would see some colored edges such as blue, yellow, red, purple magenta around objects, particularly in high contrast situations. Too wide of the opening can actually cause chromatic aberrations where it can be more apparent. The place to keep an eye out when looking for chromatic aberration is anywhere in your image where there's a lot of contrast. Although you can remove low levels of chromatic aberration in Photoshop or Lightroom, the reality is that each extra moment you spend on touching up a photograph is one moment less you have to get something else done. It'd be better if you can avoid them altogether in camera. Here are the methods to prevent chromatic aberration as much as possible. In regards to aperture, you can try increasing your f-number or reducing your f-stops. Other methods are such as framing your subject in the center of the scene and using a fixed focal length. Chromatic aberrations can be divided into different categories, but it'll be a wide topic altogether, so I'll keep it simple for now. Next, we talk about vignetting. Vignetting is quite commonly seen in photography and is simply a darkening of the image corners when compared to the center. Vignetting can be caused by our camera lenses and also added in post-production to allow us to focus more on the subject in the center of the frame. In terms of aperture, we must know that there are three types of vignetting, namely mechanical, optical, and pixel. In general, mechanical vignetting happens when there's a physical obstruction to the lens, such as a poorly designed lens hood or filter obstructing your lens. Simply removing the obstruction or increasing or sloping down your f-number, thus narrowing the aperture opening, can correct this vignetting. Optical vignetting is when the dark corners are caused by light hitting the lens aperture at a strong angle, and this particularly appear in wide open or large aperture lenses. So stopping down your f-number, hence narrowing that aperture opening, can correct this vignetting. For pixel vignetting is more camera tag related. This type of vignette is when light hitting the sensor at a strong angle may not hit part of the sensor, and the strongest light angles will be found at the image edges. However, with the advancement of camera technology, camera sensors are being modernized to correct this vignette. Good to know nonetheless. Some photographers may deem vignetting as destructive to their images, so it really comes down to personal preferences. For me personally, as long as the vignetting is not too pronounced, it can really add some depth to my images, creating a focus on what lies in the center of the image. Next, we talk about ghosting or lens flares. Lens flares occur when a bright or brighter light source enters and bounces off different glass elements in your lens, diaphragm and camera sensor, producing streaks of light across your image. Though it may seem to appear as a natural phenomenon in photos, it can potentially destroy your photos as well. Likewise, lens flares are subdivided into a few types, but in terms of aperture, we will talk about ghost flare. Ghosting flare appear as circular artifacts or orbs in each image, referred to as ghosts. Usually, the more glass elements in the lens, the more ghosts will appear in your images. When a lens is stopped down or f-number is being increased, the lens diaphragm can cause internal reflections, causing more ghosting flares. So to minimize unwanted bad lens flare affecting your image, you can use a lens hood to minimize the flare, while if you want to create creative lens flare otherwise, you can remove the lens hood altogether. Next is simply using a hand or object to block the intensity of the light, or just changing your perspective and framing can do as well. You can use the person you're photographing to block the light and let the light peek out behind them. Next is by ensuring your lens cleanliness and using a higher quality filter such as those with multi-coating lens elements. And depending on your preferences, you can make some flare to your benefit instead of seeing as a destructive element. Next danger is overusing large apertures. Larger apertures are usually used in portraiture works, where you want the subject's face to be in focus while the rest blurred out, but bear in mind to never overusing it. For example, if you have a nice background, you want your subject to complement the background and not completely blurring it out. Now that you know the dangers of aperture, let's get into more of the better parts of camera aperture. First benefit is that we can get those sunbursts or sunstars or starry effects by adjusting our aperture. Many years ago, I wondered if it's special effects made only by some sort of filter put at the front of the lenses, but boy, am I wrong. Those starfish-like starry or sunburst effects can be made from your lens, regardless whether you place a star filter in front of it. The reason behind this again lies on the number of aperture blades in your lens. So depending on the number of blades in your lens, you can get 6, 8 and even 18 sunbeams. A trick to this is, even numbers of aperture blades will give equal to the number of sunbeams, while odd numbers will give the double amount of sunbeams. Why is this so? In aperture blades with even numbers, half of the sunbeams will overlap with the other half, while in aperture blades with odd numbers, the light will pass through each of the aperture blades' corner and edges, doubling the amount compared to the number of aperture blades. For some good effects of sunbursts, try higher f numbers or f16 for instance. Apart from the sunbeam, starry, starburst effects, aperture blades also form different shapes such as rounded or sharp edges. Some aperture blades may be more rounded while some may be straight, giving a different effect to the bokeh produced. Rounded aperture blades will give a more pleasant looking rounded background light blur, while those with straighter aperture blades will give a more well-defined background light blur. It really all comes down to personal preferences and depend on the situation you're in, but generally a more rounded background light blur is preferred. Sometimes you want to get those sun flare effects as well, and its size and shape will also depend on your aperture as mentioned earlier. The next benefit of aperture is hiding unwanted elements in your photos. Aperture can also hide some unwanted elements, whether it's on your camera lens or the object in the foreground you're shooting at. As we now know, the smaller the aperture number, the larger the aperture opening and the larger the foreground and background blur, producing a shallower depth of field. This in turn will hide or even cancel out the foreground elements which you don't wish to see. One example is if you are shooting an animal in a confined area within the safety limits behind the cage. Now bear in mind that there may still be specks of dust seen in your picture despite reducing the aperture number and opening up your aperture opening. And this mainly lies in the problem of dust getting stuck at your camera sensors. So make sure you get a dust blower to get rid of any dust from your camera sensor time to time. With post-production softwares such as Lightroom or Photoshop, these unwanted elements can be removed, but it's still recommended to correct this before taking your photo to save more time during post-production. Overall, aperture is just part of the exposure triangle, which consists of ISO and shutter speed as well. I'll put the links for ISO and shutter speed in the description below in the near future, so stay tuned. So at the end of the day, it really depends on your preferences and style of photo shoot. Whether you prefer out of focus, nice rounded or sharp edges lights, light flares or starry lights in your photos. Most important, take out that camera of yours, find something to capture and put the understanding of aperture into practice. Meanwhile, do check out my previous video on aperture if you haven't done so, and my other videos in this channel for a better understanding on photography. I'm Maximilian Wong. Hope this video will help you in your photography journey. If it does, be sure to click that like and subscribe button for more content such as this. Till then, take care and stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.